Out.
Welcome to our podcast. My name is Keely Severson, and I am here with my co-hosts Eric Johnson and Alicia Swami, and together we are Exposing Mold. Today we are here with John Banta. John, welcome so much. Thank you so much, for joining our podcast. You know, you're one of these figures in the mold world where your reputation really precedes you, and we've been wanting to have you on for a long time. So thank you so much for joining our podcast.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm looking forward to this.
I appreciated that you sent me a copy of the 4th edition of this book, Prescriptions for Healthy Home, that you co-authored. And I just wanted to ask you a question to start our conversation about hypersensitivity, because I noticed that you wrote something about your family in here, and this really piqued my curiosity as someone who has been severely injured from mold, and I would consider myself a hypersensitive, like a mold reactor. I found it really interesting that you were like thanking your family and even called out like their health had suffered in the early years of your career when you didn't know as much as you did before. And I thought that was such an interesting statement, because you're acknowledging how much the industry has changed, how much growth has happened, and also the type of sensitivities that can really be caused harm by people not understanding this issue in depth. And I was just wondering, I know this is a little bit of a personal question to start, but if you could just share with us a little bit about what that was like for you, if they did suffer health symptoms, and if, you know, as your knowledge grew, that helped them.
So my wife and I got married in 1976. Our first daughter was born in 1980. And I had always been a fan of TV shows like Bob Vila's This Old House, and just, you know, really liked the concept of fixing up old places, but really had no background or experience. And actually, the first house that we purchased was out in the middle of a neighborhood that was surrounded by almond orchards. And so there was a lot of crop dusting that was going on and all kinds of things there. But that particular house, and again, I was a complete novice. We purchased it and discovered that the kitchen sink was leaking. So we had mold back behind that cabinet. We had a built-in swamp cooler, which is bad enough by itself if they're not kept clean and maintained. But in this case, this one was dripping into the wall cavities. And then when my wife was 9 months pregnant in 1980, the place actually took on a ½ an inch of water. I was outside trying to sandbag and keep it from coming in, while my wife, 9 months pregnant, was mopping it up and doing the best that she could. But, you know, we did like a lot of new parents do. We got the nursery ready for our little one, and new carpet, new paint, brought her home, and almost immediately she began reacting to the indoor environment. Looking back, I'm pretty sure that our carpet was loaded with 4PC, which is a very noxious volatile compound that has that new carpet sort of smell. And hard on her, hard on me too. You know, I mean, I was working at the University California, Davis at the time as a medical research technician, amongst other things. And so during the time that I was there, I was exposed to enough formaldehyde to pickle an elephant. And basically, we went through a lot of health problems in that home. We ended up selling it because of the chemical exposures, not even realizing that, you know, the areas of mold growth was a likely issue as well. Bought an old Victorian 1906, it had been built in. And I started preparing the outside. It was in bad condition. So I started prepping it to get it ready for painting. And 2 weeks into that process, I mean, I'm doing this myself nights and weekends. 2 weeks into the process, our oldest daughter really started failing to thrive. You go in the morning to wake her up, ask her a question, and she just, you know, very little response. And turned out I had poisoned my family with lead-based paint. The the action level back then in 1980 was 40 micrograms per deciliter of blood. The current action level, actually, I'm not completely up to date on this. Haven't been following as closely as I probably should, but it was 10 for a long time. There was talk about reducing it down to 5 micrograms per deciliter of blood. I don't know if that's actually happened, but our oldest daughter's lead level was 57 micrograms. My level was 43 and my wife's was 40. So we all ended up having to undergo chelation. Very grateful for the clinical ecologist who was also our daughter's pediatrician. We got her in right away, and about 5 minutes into her workup, she looked right at me and she said, "Is anybody in your neighborhood doing any work with lead-based paint?" And as soon as she said it, it was like, how could I have been so stupid? Yeah, that's exactly what we were doing. So that house didn't have a mold problem, but ended up having to learn how to deal with the lead. We were a young married couple. We didn't have the money to hire a company to come in do lead abatement, but was fortunately able to take advantage of the university research library and understand what the concepts were behind cleaning up lead-based paint and not having it, continue to cause exposures. And so we went into a program of monitoring to make sure that our levels came down and stayed down. And I instituted lead-safe work practices, or that's what we're calling them today. And, so that was my introduction. By 1987, I had started doing full-time environmental investigations. And most of my work back then was lead and asbestos and radon and formaldehyde. But this whole mold thing kept popping up. And I became more and more interested in it. Ended up going back to school, getting my degree in environmental health sciences from Prescott College. Was actually able to do a mentored learning program for some of my courses, and was honored to have Dr. Chin Yong as my mentor in mycology and microbiology. And, I just started paying more and more attention to this whole mold thing. By 1997, so 10 years into my career, I went to work for Jim Holland at RestCon Environmental in Sacramento, California. And basically, Jim is the smartest person that I know with regards to water damage and restoration work, and how to approach those things from the standpoint of actually getting buildings dry in ways that can prevent biological organisms from actively growing. So he was the water damage expert side of our company, and he brought me in as the mold expert side, except that, back then, 25 years ago, as Eric can attest, we were all learning a lot on a fast learning curve ever since. But basically, by the time that I had joined RestCon Environmental, it was quite clear that my wife was mold sensitive and suffering from mold exposure as well. So when we moved to California, we moved from Prescott, Arizona. When we moved to California, I was able to use the things that I had learned over the years to basically find us a good home that did not have a mold problem, and my wife did very well in it. About 10 years later, we sold it because the nearby airport had changed their flight path and had turned our home into a flight path. And so it was just too noisy. Was able to buy a second house that didn't have a mold problem. And a couple of things happened while we owned it, but was always able to get them taken care of. My wife went through a lot of healing during that first home, and in the second home, she was a real canary, where she was able to, sense things. I came home from work one evening. She met me at the door and she said, "There's something wrong in the kitchen." And I said, "Okay, what's wrong?" And she said, "That's not my job. That's your job." So, so that night I pulled the refrigerator out, and basically the water supply line for the refrigerator had started to leak. And was fortunate. She caught it quickly, and she didn't know what was wrong, but she knew something was wrong. And there was only about 6 square inches of visible mold. There was only a couple square feet of actual water, and none of it had gotten behind any of the cabinets on either side. So that night I had my air filtration device, HEPA vacuum cleaner, and containment materials out, and was doing remediation in our own home. So we lived in that home until just a little bit after COVID started, and lockdown started to occur. And at that point, we sold that home, moved back to Prescott, Arizona, which is the home that we're in now, and actually purchased a home knowing that it had a mold problem in it. And, basically had spent 90 days looking for a place to buy, had looked at 50 places, and had rejected all of them, not always because of mold, but had rejected all of them for one reason or another. At the end of the 90 days, the real estate agent was getting a little bit perturbed at, going through 50 homes and not accepting any of them. She pulled me off to the side and she said, "John, you've been telling me about what you do for a living. Isn't it about time you put your money where your mouth is?" And I asked her what that meant. And she said, "Well, on your first or second day looking, you saw a place, you liked the location, you liked the layout. Basically, you liked everything about it, except you saw 3 separate areas of growth, mold growth. And you told me you weren't going to buy a place that had a mold problem because of your wife." She said, "But you've been telling me all about, the people that you've worked with and the things that you've done. Seems to me that this place, they've already dropped the price by $40,000. It's been on the market for almost 90 days now. I think I can get them to drop the price further. If I can get a good price for you, where you believe that you can take care of the problems, will you buy it?" So now it was time to go back to my wife and ask her, because she's the ultimate authority on these things, because she's the one that's getting sick. And so I asked her, and she looked at me and she said, "John, I trust you. Don't mess up." And so she went off to live with our youngest daughter, who was just getting ready to have a new grandchild for us. And so she spent 6 weeks there. I spent 6 weeks in the house, remediating it myself. During that time, I developed a new form of testing that I've been using a whole lot more now for my clients. I'm calling it pathways testing. I think we may end up talking a little bit about that later on, but that was where I actually first pulled this methodology together and started getting excited about it, because it actually helped me find 2 additional areas of hidden mold without any destructive types of investigation. So I knew where the problems with mold were in the home before I got started. So that's—
Can you tell us now a little bit more about that testing and how it works to find the source?
Sure.
I think that's interesting.
Sure. Well, so, the whole concept of pathways, there's the pathway that we have to follow to get from a moldy place to a successful place for people to reoccupy when they have sensitivities. I'm not hypersensitive to mold. If I were, I couldn't have been doing this for the last 35 years like I have been. We always, of course, need to cater to the most sensitive person in the household. And so anyway, the concept behind it is that our homes are built out of inert materials like metal, glass, concrete, plastics, things of that nature, which don't support mold growth all by themselves. If they get dirty and they get damp, then sure, mold can grow on those surfaces, but it's not growing in the material. The material is not providing the nutrients per se. And then our buildings are built out of carbohydrates, wood and paper and cardboard types of products. So the framing, of course, sheetrock with gypsum wallboard, paper on the outside of it. In older homes, button board, various types of building papers, cellulose insulations. All of these, given enough time and moisture, can end up developing mold growth. And when mold starts to grow on it, it converts the carbohydrates in those materials into peptide bonds and proteins. Basically, all allergens are made up of proteins and peptide bonds. And so various enzymes and things like that, again, proteins and peptide bonds. But the idea is that this is what makes up their cellular structure. And so when you go from having maybe a normal of fewer than 25 organisms per square inch, all the way up to between 1 to 10 million per square inch in an area that's got visible mold growth on it, basically that's a lot of protein that's being produced in a very small visible area. And what we found is that, if you've got, let's say, 1 million in a small confined area, maybe we got a square foot. If you take a look 6 inches out from where that growth is, you're going to find that there's still an elevated level, because those surfaces, they get damp. They don't stay wet as long, so they don't grow as much. But you could have 100,000 colony forming units per square inch, or even 1,000 or less per square inch, and have that be too much for people that have sensitivities. And so we're able to use these methods to help find the hotspots. Basically, there has to be a pathway for the organisms to get from the hidden location inside the wall out into the living space. If you have an airtight wall assembly, that may not be real good from the standpoint of it drying out as quickly or quickly enough. But the thing is, if it is airtight, then problems that are hidden in there can't necessarily migrate out into the direction, into the interior. However, our homes are filled with nooks and crannies. They are rarely built airtight. And even if they are airtight, things happen that change that. Buildings will settle. I find that I oftentimes get more calls from the San Francisco Bay Area after an earthquake, because it shakes things up and it opens up new cracks and pathways. And so what we're looking for with this testing method is, where are these organisms working their way out of the living space? And the primary location, the number one spot that we find it, is where the baseboard meets the top of the floor. So assuming that we have a hard surface floor, frequently we'll have a space or opening where the baseboard meets the top of the floor, large enough to slip a business card into. And really a crack the size of a human hair is like a freeway for mold to migrate out of those hidden types of locations. So your typical human hair is about 100 microns in cross-sectional diameter, where your typical mold spore is about 2 to 20 microns in size. And that doesn't even consider that as mold gets older, goes dormant, eventually dies off, it starts to break down into smaller and smaller particles. And those tiny particles become extremely, well, they're respirable. That's the term we use. We inhale them all the way down into the air sacs in our lungs, where they can cross through that barrier between the alveoli and the circulatory system and be absorbed into our circulatory system. So in effect, as mold becomes older, it's been hypothesized that it becomes more dangerous. One of the things that I've been thinking about is, basically we become human air purifiers. As we inhale these things into our lungs, it's being filtered out or it's being passed through into our circulatory system. And if we're in good health, hopefully it's going to be filtered out and broken down by our various organs like liver and kidneys and things of that nature that help to detoxify us or remove problem particles from our system. So anyway, with pathways, we do the testing the exact same way in every single location throughout the home. The primary place that we look at is that space right next to where the floor and the baseboard meet. We use a special swab for collecting the sample, which is made out of microfibers. Microfibers do an amazing job of picking up the tiny particles. And that's one of the big things that I really wish people would do instead of using paper towels or terry cloth towels. I wish remediators would switch to using the disposable microfiber because they just do such a far superior job to picking things up. And so we use these swabs to collect the samples. By collecting over the same size surface area for every sample, we can compare them all to one another, and we can get an idea where our hotspots are and where the normal levels are. And it helps to focus us in on those locations where we've got, higher levels of peptide bonds and proteins. So we can use it before any remediation to help identify hidden types of areas. Typically, I like to see something like an Erme first, or actually in our case, we're using a modified Erme. We call it an EPA 39 because we actually add 3 additional organisms to that sample. But in any case, when we find a hotspot, then we have to go into the mode of determining, is that hotspot actually a mold or bacterial problem from water damage, or is it something else? So like, for example, if I were to spill an egg on the floor, eggs are loaded with protein, and I were to clean it up but not do a very good job, and I collected a swab from that area, I'm going to come up with a real high level of proteins and peptide bonds. And so what we have to do is figure out, is this really a problem, or is it just something that needs more cleaning to get it taken care of? And so typically what we'll do after we have our initial indications of where the hotspots are is we'll have the place cleaned. The homeowner will hire a company to come in and do cleaning, or in a lot of cases, I find a lot of people are very good at cleaning places themselves, and oftentimes will do a better job because it's their health that's on the line. So I'm not necessarily suggesting that people that have the higher degree of sensitivities do it, but maybe a family member or a friend or somebody that's willing to help them, or even a hired housekeeper that they can teach in the methods of effective cleaning. But the idea is to get it cleaned. And then I always encourage people to test it immediately after the cleaning's been done to see whether the cleaning was effective or not. Because what we're going to do then is wait approximately 1 to 2 weeks for the building to start to reach a new equilibrium and go back into those areas that were hotspots the first time around and retest and see whether or not the levels are rising gradually or coming up exponentially. And if they're coming up exponentially, then that becomes a place where it's not going to be an egg that spilled on the floor. The egg was cleaned up, it was tested clean. But if something is coming up at a rapid rate, a more rapid rate, then there's something in that wall cavity that is working its way out. And, things like rodent feces and pollens certainly can affect these results. But what we find is that it's the mold spores and fragments and the bacteria that are able to work their way out more readily. The other things seem to come out at a much slower rate, if they're even there.
Thank you for explaining that. That's quite the mouthful with the pathways testing, but it's interesting that there's something that can help people determine if there's a local source issue that needs to be remedied, because I know sometimes people are just poking into their walls, and it's like, we did an interview with Brian Carr. Well, if you're 8 inches away from where that colony is growing, how many holes do you need in your walls to find out what's really in there?
Yeah. And so we color code our results. Green means that the levels of proteins and peptide bonds are low. Yellow means that they're higher than we would like them to be, but not terrible, although there's a spectrum. There's the low end of the yellows and there's the high end. The high end of the yellows is approaching what we would list as orange. And we diagram all this out on floor plans, and we'll show the colored spots. And then we'll do them sequentially. So you can see that initially it was an orange area or a red area. And then with cleaning, it went down to green. And then 2 weeks later, it's back up into the high yellow, almost orange range. And so that allows us to then say, hey, when we look at the other areas, the control areas, we have this gradual rise where it might go up a little bit, but it's not going up significantly. And so the hot spots are the ones that we really need to pay attention to. Now, one of the real advantages of this testing, it doesn't tell us whether it's mold, doesn't tell us whether it's bacteria or something else. but it's relatively cheap. It's based on 100-year-old technology. It's called biuret testing, which was able to identify proteins and peptide bonds, and was used a whole lot for, the food industry in the early years. I can remember in high school, in my physiology class, we did some chemistry tests for starches and fats and simple sugars and more complex carbohydrates and proteins. And although I don't remember specifically that many years ago, I'm pretty sure that this is a derivative of that method. What we're doing now is actually 1,000 times more sensitive than the original biuret method. Did I say 1,000? I meant 100 times. 100 times more sensitive. And the other thing is it's not sensitive to soaps or detergents, which the original biuret method was very sensitive to them. Of course, people use soaps and detergents in their homes, so we want something that's not going to show us a false reading based on the soaps or detergents. But it's relatively inexpensive. We're able to offer it for like $10 per sample. But we need to have a lot of samples. We usually figure about 100 samples per 1,000 square feet of buildings. So, I mean, it's not cheap, but at the same time, it's a lot cheaper than cutting those, 8 or so holes in various areas and not finding it that way. So it's a non-destructive method. But again, if there's no pathway, if things are sealed up tight, you won't find it that way. So sometimes we'll be finding high levels within the living space, and the baseboards are all sealed up tight. And then we have to start looking, well, is it coming in around cracks and crevices around the window? Is it coming through electrical outlets? When we have situations up in ceilings, the spores are coming down from a cathedral ceiling that's improperly ventilated. They tend to filter out and spread out. So we find a more even distribution across the entire floor. Whereas with things coming from the wall cavities, we see that greatest buildup of the highest level of the biomass, whatever it is, in that 1 to 2 inches away from the wall. So from the baseboard, a few inches out is the highest. And so we're also finding a lot of good applications with regards to monitoring cleaning. You get a new housekeeper and you're not sure if they're doing a good job when they're cleaning. You can do a bunch of these tests and see whether they're getting it down into the green. And then you can also monitor over time and see how long does it take to leave what we consider an acceptable level and get up into higher levels of peptide bonds and proteins. That can guide how often cleaning is necessary.
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
Have you ever had a hypersensitive person complain about still being symptomatic after it reached what you consider the acceptable level, the green?
Yes. Yeah. And that's one of the things that we have to recognize is, like, for example, with the HERTSME 2 5 organism system for evaluating for conditions that would tend to exacerbate chronic inflammatory response syndrome developed by Dr. Richie Shoemaker. He's got his scale where he says if your HERTSME numbers are below 10, then it's likely to be very good. But he still says that in 1.3% of the cases, he's still going to have a sensitivity amongst them. And the same is true on the higher end of things. He says that above 16, people with CIRS are going to have problems. But that in 1.3% of the cases, you'll still have people that are non-symptomatic, even at those very high levels that would cause problems for, the vast majority of people. So yes, sensitivities are one of those things that can be a real challenge to deal with. And fortunately, I would say right now, probably 80% of my clientele is referred by their physicians. And working as a team is very helpful from the standpoint of they have their biological testing that they can do with their patients. We can do the various types of investigations and tests with the building. And by working together, oftentimes they're able to come back and say, well, it seems like this symptomology is residual, we're finding that there are various tests, and whether it's C4A or visual continuity or whatever, we're finding that they're getting better, that they're back into the normal range. But maybe this is something that's going to take some time for them to clear. In my wife's case, it's been 25 years that she's been able to be in good living environments. And so if she gets into a place that's got a problem, she will generally know it within a minute or two. And she'll make a decision. Is this something that I really need to stay here? Or is this something that I'm going to exit and let John make the explanations why we're not going to stay for the dinner party that we were invited to?
I caught wind of that conversation, or that rhetoric between the two of you watching a podcast you did, and you mentioned that you guys were traveling to Ireland, and you had made considerations to have the Airbnbs checked out, but there was just one where you made me giggle when you said it, like, well, and she doesn't even bother making excuses anymore, like she just leaves me to deal with it. And we're like, yeah, as it should be, like.
Absolutely. And there may be circumstances, like if a family member is getting married and the reception hall has got a problem, my wife might choose to stay and then suffer for 4 days after that. In my wife's case, she doesn't have brain fog. She's as sharp as can be. Trouble keeping up with her sometimes, but she does have a problem with chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia pain. And if she stays beyond that particular trigger point, we just know it's going to take her about 4 days to clear once she gets back into a good place.
It sounds like she's aware of her body enough where, despite her sensitivities, she can either use her senses as a radar to keep her safe, or she just knows what to expect.
Yeah. The other thing is with so often, it's not just one thing. It's not just mold or bacteria or actinomycetes or something that has to do with water damage. My wife also has Lyme disease, and we think it's likely that she's got some co-infections too. So in that case, she has to, watch her diet and exercise moderately. And she describes it as not poking the beast. Keep it keep it under wraps. Don't do things that are going to cause it to have flare-ups.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I feel like there's this ongoing question of, do all mold hypersensitives, do we have an undiagnosed Lyme infection? Because we see it so much in mold hypersensitivity, where it's actually to the point where it can be the missing piece in a Lyme sufferer's recovery, where they can do all of the Lyme treatment under the sun, but if they don't figure out that sensitivity to mold piece, they're just not recovering.
Yeah.
But we don't have to spend a ton of time talking about Lyme. I'd like to transition, because you mentioned something really interesting about Stachybotrys chlorohalonata. I'm just wondering, what are your insights on this?
Say that 3 times real fast. So, I am a fan of Erme. I'm not a fan of the Erme score. I think that when EPA developed it, they really did a disservice. And what ended up happening was they got criticized for it quite severely. And then their reaction to it was an overreaction by basically making the statement that the testing method was only for research purposes. And of course, it was 20 years ago that EPA developed Erme and got the patent for it. Actually, it's been a little over 20 years ago. I believe it was May I believe their patent expired in May of 2020. And so it's been 20 years. And, I have some mixed feelings. I think that EPA did a wonderful thing when they developed it. But then I think they didn't show the intestinal fortitude that they should have with regards to sticking up for the test method And then the other thing I don't think they did was they didn't continue to develop it for the use by environmental consultants and people that really need these higher levels of detection in order to figure out what's going on. It wasn't too long ago that I was reviewing a study that was talking about air sampling. And what it was showing was that in order to use even the PCR, which is Erme technology, the DNA technology, you really needed to be collecting about a 48-hour air sample in order to have a significant period of time for there to be the collections during the periods of variability. And what we do is I am so sorry. My wife has just come in and said there's some kind of emergency. Can we take just a 1-minute break?
Absolutely.
Yes,
Thank you.
of
I am
course.
sorry.
No
problem.
problem at all. Okay, I'm gonna continue eating my breakfast. I hope his wife is okay.
We might have to finish this a little later, if not.
Okay, we're fine. I
Okay.
am so sorry. I
Oh,
hope
that's
you can
okay.
edit that out.
Usually it's me interrupting because my kids are crazy. Like we're really relaxed here. It's totally fine.
Yeah,
She,
know the emergency.
our kids have just recently come back from Norway, the oldest daughter and her family. And so they're back in the States and we're trying to make arrangements to visit. And she needed my personal phone and it was here beside me. So anyway, my apologies.
No problem.
And I forgot what I was starting on. So I
We were,
probably should-
you were talking about the Erme not developing the chlorohalanata sampling.
Oh, okay. Yeah, thanks. So when EPA developed this methodology, what they did was they actually developed the primers and probes for approximately 100 different species of molds. And the only one that they did with regards to Stachybotrys, there are probably, I believe, about 50 different species of Stachybotrys, but the primary one that they did was Stachybotrys shatarum. That's what everybody's been talking about for decades now. But there is no DNA testing for the Stachybotrys chlorohalanata, and it's sounding like that's going to be a really important one. The other thing is, for example, Fusarium species of mold. We're hearing about that being added in now as a mycotoxin type of testing that's being done. But when we don't have the ability to test for those organisms, or when we only have the ability to test for them using culturable methods, that leaves a whole range of things that we may not be able to be aware of. So as an example, Stachybotrys shatarum has been studied and found to have a half-life. I'm trying to remember if it was 7 months or 9 months. It was published in the Field Guide for Bioaerosols, 2nd edition. They got a little chart that talks about the half-life for certain types of molds. Let's just say it was less than a year. The half-life for Stachybotrys was less than a year. What that means is if you go through 4 cycles, so from 100% to 50% to 25% to 12% to, less than 7%, that's what happens over the course of 4 years in terms of it dying off. And so a water damage condition that's, let's say, a decade old, it might be all completely dead, and yet it's there. It's still just as much of a problem from the standpoint of allergens and toxins. Not only that, but right now I think they're only able to test for about 13 different types of toxins associated with Stachybotrys, the trichocythine types of toxins. And it's been estimated that there are over 200 different types of biotoxins that Stachybotrys can produce. So, there could be things that are going on in our homes based on biotoxins that we have no way right now from a technology standpoint of measuring, but we can measure the Stachybotrys shatarum. And unfortunately, the chlorohalonata was not one of the organisms that they developed it for. And in fact, over the last 20 years, nothing has happened with that. Nobody has developed any more primers and probes for different types of molds than what those original 100 were. And I think we really need to be looking at that. You know, it's not that hard to develop a primer and probe. There are laboratories out there that are doing this commercially all the time. And now that the EPA's patent has expired, I am looking forward to the days when these become more widely available, that that somebody who's, you know, a researcher or an investigator like myself, and I also do research, but I can go to the developers of the various primers and probes and say, hey, this is what we need. Here are 10 samples of this particular type of mold, different locations that it was collected from. We'd like you to develop the appropriate primers and probes. And I think that the technologies that we have today are just so far advanced. Unfortunately, it's expensive to use the new technologies, but what they tell us, it's like during my first years doing this, if we didn't find the actual growth and couldn't collect a tape lift off of it to identify the type of organism, and it had been something from 10, 15, 20, 30, 50 years earlier, we may not find the viable organisms necessary to culture it and figure out what's going on. Exciting times.
What about the common substances that defeat PCR testing?
Oh, inhibition. So that's been a real interest of mine. And in fact, I can't remember, I think it was at the Surviving Mold Conference in Fort Lauderdale, Florida that you presented in, Eric.
Yeah.
That I can't remember if that's where I did my presentation on inhibition.
Yeah, in fact, I recorded a little of it.
Okay, very good. Well, yes. We know that there are inhibitors that cause problems with DNA analysis. And, you know, I mean, the types of inhibitors that do that have been extensively studied for forensics, for police work, for example. They have to know, you know, when they can't use evidence in court for various crimes and things like that. And so we've been able to find out a number of things that cause inhibition based on information from medicine and police work. Blood and urine are both inhibitors, and so if you have cat urine on a surface that you're collecting your sample from, it may cause an inhibition. And so I'm gonna rag on laboratories for a minute. There are quite a number of laboratories out there that are doing various types of PCR testing. And with regards to the ones that were licensed by EPA, EPA did not dictate all of the quality control measures or the things that should be reported. And I, as an environmental consultant, I want to be able to look at a report from a laboratory and see the quality control measures that tell me, you know, what has happened with regards to a sample. So I want to know that there was enough dust in the sample. I want them to weigh the sample before they analyze it and then tell me how much weight of dust there actually was and then how much they actually used. I also want them to be doing some quality control work. There's an organism called Geotrichum candidum. It's a type of mold, and there is a primer and probe for it that was developed by EPA 20 years ago, but it's not commonly found in residential structures. When EPA first developed this, they went out and they tested 1,097 homes throughout the country, and they ran these various tests on it. And then they developed the Erme score, which again, I don't very much like. I think it can be misleading. But then they also reported on a value called the geometric mean. And what the geometric mean is, it's a statistical value that helps to focus on what is normal. And so if you have an outlier, it's not going to record it. Let me give you an example. If I had 5 houses and the numbers were 1 spore equivalent per milligram of dust of Stachybotrys, 2 spore equivalents, 3 spiller equivalents, 4 spore equivalents, and 1 million spore equivalents. If I took the average of those 5 samples, the average would end up being 200,000, which doesn't really represent the million very well, nor does it represent the 1, 2, 3, and 4 very well. On the other hand, if I took the geometric mean of 1, 2, 3, 4, and 1 million and calculated that, the geometric mean for that is 27. And I would argue that 27 is a whole lot closer to 1, 2, 3, 4, and a lot more representative of what normal would be, as opposed to 27 being representative of 1 million. So anyway, we have that value, the geometric mean, which I find to be very valuable for helping us to understand how our homes in comparison to, how is a particular home in comparison to what was seen in that 1,097 out there. And then about 3 years ago, EPA repeated that study with another 703 homes. And the values on the geometric mean came back largely the same, which gives us even more confidence that using this method for interpreting those results is valid. And then we're very fortunate to have Dr. Bonnie Passmore on our staff. Dr. Passmore has her PhD in biochemistry and physics. And she worked at UC Davis for about 10 years before joining us almost 20 years ago. And during that time that she was working at UC Davis, she was actually testing some of the first thermocyclers that were being developed to automate PCR testing. So she has a wealth of understanding and a wealth of knowledge that's been very helpful. But in any case, getting back to the geotricum control, if you get an unknown sample from your home and you add a known quantity of geotricum candidum to that sample, and then you run that sample, the results that you get back should report the approximate amount of geotricum candidum that you added to the sample. And if for some reason it's not there, then the question is, what's happened? Well, what's happened is there's some form of inhibition that has caused problems. So we were able to work with a laboratory that was willing to do the geotricum control. We supplied them with spiked samples of Stachybotrys that we had added various other types of things to. And we tested about 27 different substances that could be spilled in a home. So we tested coffee and milk and alcohol and just all kinds of things. And what we found was about 6 of those substances turned out from that list to be inhibitors. Tea tree oil was an inhibitor. And that finding that the type of biocide, it's a natural phenolic compound. It's a natural biocide which should kill. But what ends up happening is the tea tree oil actually inhibits the ability for the DNA to be analyzed. And so you could get a result back that says nothing there. And it's just absolutely false. You know, there's a lot of statements that have been made about, oh, mold is everywhere, and therefore we shouldn't worry about it. Well, some molds are everywhere. And those some molds tend not to be the problems that we find in indoor environments that have gotten water damaged. And the key difference, I believe, is temperature. You know, Stachybotrys loves to grow at 68 degrees and higher, and it grows very poorly at temperatures of below 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Whereas Cladosporium, the most common outdoor mold, it doesn't like temperatures around 68 degrees, which is the temperature we keep our homes at. Instead, it grows really well at 60 degrees Fahrenheit and lower. And in fact, a lot of species of Cladosporium will grow all the way down to freezing. And so those are the molds. The cold-loving molds for most parts of the United States tend to be the ones that are selected year round. I mean, most nights it drops down well below, 68 degrees throughout the United States. And so if you can't maintain that temperature for a long enough period of time, then the organisms aren't going to grow. And so we find that the penicilliums and aspergilluses that grow in water damage scenarios typically are mesophilic in the middle, same temperatures that we like. We like to be in the middle. And those are the ones that tend to grow in a water damage situation. Now, granted, there are some penicilliums that will grow at much colder temperatures. We've all seen mold develop in our refrigerator on different types of food items. But those are not the same types of organisms that we typically find as a problem with regards to water damage. Doesn't mean I'm encouraging people to eat that moldy piece of fruit. No, I'm not. But it's probably not the same types of organisms.
I heard a rumor that gypsum might be a PCR inhibitor.
So gypsum, we actually tested that. Gypsum in and of itself is not an inhibitor. However, a lot of gypsum wallboard has clay in it. And it turns out that clay is an inhibitor. When we were doing our initial 27 things to look at inhibitors, we were trying to get pure cat urine to test, and kitties don't like to cooperate with providing those kinds of samples. So what we did was we allowed the cat to go in the litter box. We got the purest form of clay litter that we could. We let the cat go in the litter box. And then we did two samples. We did clay and we did cat urine and clay mixed together. And they were both inhibited. We couldn't get any results from either one of them. And that's one of the, boom, on goes the light bulb. Some, not many, but some of my clients had places made out of adobe. Others have had places made out of straw clay. That's a big thing for my co-author Paula Baker report for our book Prescriptions for a Healthy House. Her husband and her have promoted that system of construction for as long as I've known them. And anyway, and then there are clay washes that are used instead of paint. And we found lots of those buildings are inhibited. We can't get results back. If you get an Erme that comes back with everything completely non-detected, including the group 2s, which would be the cladosporiums and various other types of common outdoor sorts of molds, it's probably not a valid result. It's probably because there was clay or rust. Iron oxide will do it. The literature says that just about any kind of metal oxide, so aluminum oxide, lead oxide from lead-based paint. Let's see. So based on our tea tree oil research, we found that phenolics are inhibitors. If you look at a lot of the essential oils that are being used in various types of mold treatments, I'm of the opinion that they oftentimes are causing an inhibition of the results, not actually getting rid of it or killing it and making it disappear. Not only that, but I find so many of my clients are really hypersensitive to odors and essential oils. You're just replacing one type of problem with another, especially when you consider there's a big difference between, a couple of drops of an essential oil in a big pot of soup versus using it over 1,000 square feet of building. It doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, back to chlorhalonata. The most frightening thing I heard at the Fort Lauderdale conference was that it produces immune suppressing compounds without the inflammatory ones that would give you warning to its presence.
Yeah, and the concern there for me, I mean, that's a concern, but I'm not a doctor, so I get to gloss over those things because I don't practice medicine. I practice building related types of investigations, but here's the thing: if it is a problem, we don't have a good test for it. Once it starts to break down, you can culture it when it's young and new and fresh, and find it that way, or do a tape lift and find it that way. But if we're looking at it from the standpoint of several decades old, I have no idea what its life expectancy is. We know what it is for Stachybotrys shatarum. We don't know for for Stachybotrys chlorhelonata. And so are we dealing with levels of biotoxins that it produces that are still present decades later, but we have no way right now to test for it. So I really hope that the EPA's patent expiring will result in companies that develop primers and probes starting to make these things available. We'll certainly add them into our panel as soon as it's available. And I'm haven't had time, but I really do want to see that end up happening.
There's a lot of discussion about everything has to be thrown away. People are tossing all their possessions, everything they own. Well, I put my stuff in storage and I couldn't even visit it for several years. But at the 5-year mark, it completely melted away. All the toxic value disappeared. And all the stuff that I had in there, even without cleaning, became completely inert after 5 years.
And one of the questions in my mind, and I don't have an answer for it, and I'm not a doctor, but I wonder if the toxins are disappearing, or if you were developing more of an ability to tolerate. You know, they've got the bucket concept where
Right.
everything is fine till you fill the bucket to the top and then it starts spilling over. And at least from my wife's experience, as she got further away from when she was being highly reactive, the bucket got bigger so that there was more space to fill it. And so very likely could be a combination of the two.
Well, of course, I wanted to find that out. So I had somebody else reproduce this experience and found independently that it was the same thing with the 5-year mark. And we actually went back and forth and cross-checked each other so that we could verify that it was the same for both of us, even though our mold experience was in different places.
Have you published?
No, I thought we need to look into this because a
We
lot of
need to
people are
look into
throwing
this.
things away on the basis that it will never die down.
Yeah.
And we're not sure if that's true or not.
So, you know, it's been my experience that in most cases, hard surfaced items can be cleaned effectively. But you know, a lot of people, when I watch them do the cleaning, they're either using ineffective methods or they're skipping spots. They're not, you know, doing as thorough of a job as they need to. And so I do encourage people, you know, there's some things that should have been thrown away, whether it had a mold problem or not. And so those things you automatically get rid of. And then there are the things that are easy to clean and not a big deal from that standpoint. And I think that those are real important and helpful things to do. But I've had people that have thrown away family memorabilia, their childhood photos of their parents and things like that. And once they, you know, start feeling better and realize that it's gone, it's just very sad. And so I encourage people to store things. You can always make the decision to throw it away later. But if you wrap something up, seal it up tightly in packaging, then, you know, it should stay good. The one thing that I would tell people they need to do is add some desiccant packets. Silica gel packets are easily available, and you don't want to be trapping the moisture inside a box or something like that, or plastic wrap, because it can result in mold growth inside. If you have a temperature change, if the temperature drops, then the humidity levels will rise. A 20-degree difference in temperature, as the temperature drops 20 degrees, the relative humidity drops or goes up by 100%. So going from 77 degrees Fahrenheit to 57 degrees Fahrenheit, if you have 50% relative humidity inside a box that gets sealed up, it will rise up to 100%. And of course, at 100%, there's going to be enough moisture for a lot of different types of molds to grow.
I just have a question, just like, I feel like I know the answer to this question, but if there's a chance you could give me a different answer.
Mhm.
My son's in a moldy middle school and I'm actively avoiding mold. We have protocols in place for his clothes and his shower right when he comes home, and there's no alternative schooling methods available. What do you recommend that people wash our clothes with? Even though I've had this protocol in place, his clothing was completely ruined by the end of the year. So this follow-up year, we're going to do it separately, where we have clothes that are just for school and clothes that are just for the home. But are there any washing protocols that can stop this stuff from taking hold and actually ruining clothes? Because I'm one of those people that's reacting to non-porous items that no matter what I do, I can't get clean.
Mhm. Well, and that is difficult. One thing I would suggest is that you take a look at what kind of synthetic materials you might be wearing clothing wise. Just like a magnet, opposites attract. And so if you have natural mold spores with negative charge and synthetic clothing with a positive charge, you become like a dust magnet and attract these sorts of things in. I have found that in most cases, laundering with a regular soap or detergent, I like Branch Basics. I like 7th generation Free and Clear. But typically this will get the spores out. Now, if you've had actual growth that's occurred in them, different story. But if it's just spores and fragments that have gotten into the materials, then typically that will take them out. And I find that line drying is usually more acceptable than drying in a closed dryer. One of the things I've been able to track down on several occasions have been clients that have popped their clothes into clothes dryers in moldy parts of a home. And what the clothes dryer is doing is creating a negative pressure that's pulling a higher concentration of those spores out. And then it's getting into the air and it's passing through the clothing as the clothing is drying, so that you end up with it redepositing, new things redepositing. Now, in a home that doesn't have a mold problem, I don't necessarily have an explanation for it, but those are the types of things that are certainly worth looking at.
I know we're right up on the hour mark and I want to be respectful of your time. Does anyone else have any final questions or words of wisdom before we wrap up here?
No, that's been a great talk.
I'd like to mention my new book. It was co-authored with Paula Baker Laporte. It's called Prescriptions for a Healthy House, a practical guide for architects, builders, and homeowners. We've expanded since the 3rd edition. There's an additional approximately 75 pages in it. And almost all of those are pages about water damage and mold. And if your listeners either go to our company's website at www.pathwaystesting.com, or well, if you go to that site, you can click on a link and you'll be able to enter a code, Banta, capital B-A, capital, all capital B-A-N-T-A, and you'll get a 10% discount. But it's also available through Amazon and other book sources. You know, so far the biggest complaint we've had is it's expensive. It's $65 for this 399 page book, and that is a lot of money to put out. I wish we could do it for less. And what we have been able to do is offer it electronically in Kindle version for $25. So just be aware that it is out there that way as well.
Great. I wanted to ask, would it be okay if we're able to maybe raffle off a free copy to our audience members?
Absolutely.
Great. So we'll post that when this episode comes up for airing, and then I'll just give you the address of the winner, and then you could just send directly.
Okay. Very
Great.
good.
Well, thank you so much, John, for joining us. It was a great conversation. You're so seasoned in this industry, and so you've seen it all, and you've dealt with mold issues personally in your own life. It's just maddening, isn't it?
It is. I haven't seen it all though. I don't think a week or two goes by that something new doesn't pop up. And it's like I'm 67 years old now.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons that I moved to Arizona was to slow down a little bit and put a little more focus into research and writing, and then telephone consulting. Spending 6 hours a day in Bay Area traffic was taking its toll.
Oh my gosh.
But I'm putting in as many hours as ever, and I doubt that I'll ever retire. But
I know it's a labor of love.
It really is. It really is.
Yeah. I'm a former Bay Area I don't know, personite, Bay Areaite. I don't know how, what's the proper terminology there, but I totally understand. It's just it's an interesting place. It's just a little too crowded.
Well, not only that, but I think that we really do have, when we look at our geometric mean for our office and the samples that we've collected in the Bay Area, we do find a higher geometric mean for Stachybotrys and other types of molds in San Francisco. And I think that, you know, the styles of construction, you've got buildings that are right next to each other, zero clearance, where there's no ability to really fix walls the right way.
Yeah.
And then buildings were built in the early 1900s, and back then they weren't building them as tightly as we do today. You know, okay, so we didn't have as much mold in the 1906 buildings because we used lead-based paint, and that was a wonderful antimicrobial. But you know, you tear those materials out, you put gypsum drywall back in, you don't do a good job of sealing up the exterior so that the water's not coming in. And now you've got a problem. Or if you seal it up with elastomeric paints, which trap the moisture inside the walls. In the Bay Area, moisture is trying to flow from the interior and dry to the outside. It hits the outside of that elastomeric paint. And we've seen bubbles, you know, the size of a baseball that form on the outside of a house, and you stick a pin in them and the water just starts spraying out at you. And that's all because, you know, we exhale a quart of moisture a day when you add in cooking and cleaning and bathing and everything else. You know, that's almost a gallon per person per day in a building. And if it can't get out, something's going to go.
Yeah.
Something's going to give.
And I'm gonna leave you with this last question. So in your experience, what has been your most mind-blowing discovery in the world of environmental testing?
So my most mind-blowing one I'm not able to talk about because I'm under a confidentiality agreement.
Oh, man.
Which
Okay.
is a whole nother show. We can talk about, you know, the problems with, you know, trying to do the right thing and ending up in a situation where if you say something, you get in trouble. But I think the one that I can talk about, a house in Phoenix, Arizona, the reason I can talk about it is because it did go to court. And I was deposed in that case, so it was public record. The family knew they had a mold problem. It was discovered that a refrigerator water supply line had been leaking probably for 3 months, caused massive amounts of Stachybotrys to grow. The company that came in to remediate the mold basically pulled out one side of a wall in a kitchen, left the mold in the other side of the wall and behind the cabinets and everything, and then set up ozone generators to try to kill the mold. They ran the ozone generators for 48 hours, turned them off, let the place sit for another 24 hours. And at the end of that, they said, it's okay, the mold's all dead, you don't have to worry about it. And so the family came back, they dropped off the dogs and went off to work and to school. And when they got back at the end of the day, both dogs were dead with blood coming out of their noses. And unfortunately, by the time I got involved with the case, both of the dogs' bodies were gone. They'd been incinerated. At that time, there was a laboratory in Germany that could test for satrotoxin and a couple of other toxins associated with Stachybotrys, but it was $6,000 per test and 6 months to get the results back. But it would have been worth it to be able to see whether the bleeding noses was caused by that. I mean, pulmonary hemosiderosis in children. So, but the thing is, one of the dogs was an older dog, and if it had died, you know, then maybe it was chance, but both of them together at the same time, I think that was probably the one thing that was the most eye-opening for me. And that was 25 years ago.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if you've heard some of our recent or previous podcasts where we do talk about Ruth Etzel and Dor Dearborn and the pulmonary hemorrhage.
I had the pleasure to meet both of them at the 5th annual conference in Saratoga, New York. Yeah, outstanding researchers, just pleasure
Absolutely.
to have been able to meet them. In that case, what I believe happened was that the ozone actually stimulated the mold to produce more mycotoxins than it would have normally. Ozone generators, they're outlawed in California. There's a loophole where they can still be installed in HVAC systems. But one of the pieces of research that I came across that really had me concerned, we were told that ozone could be used to break down pesticides like malathion. And it did. You test before you have got the malathion, you test afterwards, and it's gone. But what we didn't realize was it creates byproducts. So there's a byproduct, I think it was called naloxone. And naloxone, it turns out when you treat malathion with ozone, naloxone is created, and it's 1,000 times more toxic than the malathion originally was. So I think there are just all kinds of side effects. Yeah, there may be some uses for ozone. I don't have a problem with it in ozonated water, swimming pools, hot tubs, various types of applications. But man, from the standpoint of inhaling it, I've seen so many people that have been knocked for a loop by it. And it's probably the side reactions that you just don't know what's there. So you never know when it's going to come back to bite you.
Thank you for that, John. And I wish we had like 5 hours to chat with you, but I do have one last question. I promise you I will not ask anymore and we'll let you go for the day. So there's such big interest about Klinghart's, quote unquote, his pilot study that he did, or I don't know what you want to call it, that EMFs are increasing mycotoxins. Are you seeing this as a viable?
I've not done anything personally to really follow up on that.
No. Yeah. Okay, cool. Yeah, no problem. I figured I'd ask an expert, see if they have any interest or even experience in that. So
I think that it could be an interesting area of study. One of the frustrations I think with electromagnetics is that we are definitely being bombarded by more and more and more, and I'm not sure how we're ever gonna deal with them. I would hope that we can deal with the mold, but
yeah. Let's start with the mold first.
yep, there's some things we can do in our individual homes about the electromagnetics that are great, but from the standpoint of what's going on out there, man. And it'll probably take another 30, 50, 100 years for us to really understand.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, John. I appreciate you for joining
Thank you.
us.
You take care. Bye-bye,
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone. Take care. How do I stop recording?
Just hit the record button again.